My talk last year was on the past of the animal rights movement. This year I'm going to give you my vision for the future. And there will be a question and answer period at the end, so hold your questions till then, if you can. Let's start out with the issue of wildlife. The best way to help wildlife is to create wildlife corridors. And these corridors are called wildways. And you can see from the slide back here that in North America, 4 wildways are envisioned. The 3 north-south ones all run along mountain ranges. The Eastern Wildway runs along the Appalachians. The Pacific Wildway runs along the Cascade and Sierra Ranges, and the Rocky Mountains comprise the Western Wildway. It is not accidental that the wildways are along the mountains, because that is the last place where large herds of animals roam. Also, there's fewer people in the mountainous areas. You put those 2 things together, these are the areas that are envisioned to protect the animals. And what it allows the animals to do is migrate, find mates, and live in relative safety. Because if we don't have the wildways, and the one they have now on the slide shows the way it is now, you'll see how fragmented the safe areas are. The only safe areas are in green, and you can see that everything else, it's open season on animals. Hunting, mining polluted areas, freeways. How are they supposed to get from one safe area to the next? So a word I'm going to use a lot today is connectivity. And connectivity is crucial when you're talking about the corridors. Because 2 parks that comprise 10,000 acres next to each other are much more valuable to animals than 2 parks comprising 5,000 acres separated by 20 miles. So what we're trying to do in the movement is create connectivity to the safe areas. To get the connectivity is hard, though. Right now, there's no will in the federal government. Last year, there was a bill in Congress to try to connect the corridors. It failed, of course. And we're having trouble with the states, too, because the traditional wisdom on political matters is put the parks where the people are so they can use them. And to put them where the people aren't, but the animals are, that is what's needed. So it's going to take a little bit of a change in our concept of what parks are. Now, I mentioned that there's highways and freeways, so what we need to do is put animal overpasses and underpasses. And there are a few in the United States, but there are a lot more in Europe. The animals actually use these, as you can see, and my favorite really is this one. This is my favorite slide. This is the red crabs of Christmas Island, and they're using a crab bridge. Christmas Island is just north of Australia, and once a year there's a mass migration, and this is how they get it. So that they actually use these things, and what we have to do when we build highways is include the cost of the overpasses and the underpasses. To try to go back later and retrofit is more expensive and politically difficult. So it's going to take some pre-planning to have these built in to our freeways and highways. Another issue having to do with the parks and the corridors is multi-use. Multi-use, land of many uses, sounds good. It's not working out very well. What multi-use does is it covers a conflict of various uses. One use is to protect the animals, clean water, clean air. That's the environmental aspect. Another use is to provide recreational opportunities for people. Skiing, hiking, horseback riding, biking, sometimes hunting. And the third one is, let's make some money. Let's have an addition to our tax base by the concession fees, the entrance fees, the camping fees, all these things. So you have these three purposes covered by the name multi-use, and how do you reconcile those three? I hear you ask. Well, you can't, because they're all given equal weight. If you read the mission statements of the parks, they're all given equal weight. There's no priority. And what that means is whatever the administration is of the state or federal park, they're going to change which of those three have priority. And so it's a shifting alliance. So what we need to do, and what somebody in this audience will do, I hope, is to try to get a priority of purpose for the parks along the wildways. And I understand that in New York City you may have a different set of parks, and you may have a different set of purposes. Maybe they're more geared to the people in New York, I would think so. But when you're out in the mountains, you need to have the priority for the environmental purpose. And that still needs to be done. It has not been done. The last thing I want to mention about the parks and the wildways is this. National parks are designated by Congress. National monuments are designated by the president. This has proved to be very important because in the waning years of his presidency, President Obama was able to designate a whole bunch of national monuments, which are under attack now, by the way. They're trying to undesignate them. We'll see if that's even legal. Okay, the next issue is hunting and trapping. Hunting policy is the province of the states, unless it's on federal land. And every state has a commission or agency that sets hunting policy. These commissions are heavily weighted toward hunters, fisher people, and ranchers. They're prisoners of the past. And I'll give you an example. Colorado Parks and Wildlife, CPW, has an 11-person voting commission. Of those 11 people, 6 by law are ranchers and hunters. That doesn't reflect current demographics at all. But what it means is that everything that you bring to these commissions of an environmental sense, it's going to get voted down. And this is the case in most federal and state commissions. They're heavily weighted toward hunters and ranchers, and this needs to change too. Which means we have to go to these meetings. These are public meetings that the commissions have. So we can go and speak, but they have them in out-of-the-way places, and they do that on purpose to keep the city people from going there and making our wishes known. I went to a meeting a while back. There were just 3 of us, myself, Janet, and Auburn, who's sitting right here. And we were the only 3 environmentalists there. There was a ton of hunters. There was a ton of agency people, and just us. But we got up and spoke, and when I got up and said that I was representing Vegan Life Colorado, that was a big hit, I can tell you. But we have to go to these meetings. Otherwise, the policy's never going to change. But getting back to the commissions, if you want to do one thing to help wildlife, change the composition of these commissions. They exist in every state. And trapping is the same thing. Their policies are set by the same commissions. It said hunting policy. We thought, when I was doing this work back in the 80s and 90s, that we had the fur issue under control, that it was not cool anymore to wear fur. Well, we were wrong. It's coming back. So we have to go to those meetings, and we have to make our voices known. The people that don't want to wear fur, the people that don't want to shoot animals, we're an increasing demographic, but we're not represented where we need to be represented in order to make policy. Okay, let's go on to urban animals now. I myself have seen foxes and coyotes in Denver. Raccoons come in our backyard. You always know they're there because the neighborhood dogs go crazy. But there's a ton of animals, deer, bear up in Boulder. They come into the cities now. So what are we going to do to make the cities more friendly for animals? And I mentioned connectivity in the context of the wild ways, but connectivity is equally important in the cities because the animals live in the parks. And how do they get from one park to the next without getting run over on Colfax Avenue? It's impossible for them to move around, to find mates, to find new feeding grounds. We have to adjust our notion of what cities should be. And there are 3 ways by which the animals get from park to park. Number 1, railroad tracks. Don't tear down the railroad tracks. Whether they're used or not, they cut through the neighborhoods and the animals use them. There was a study done on coy wolves in Canada. And you might not know what a coy wolf is. It's a combination between a coyote and a wolf, beautiful animal. And in Toronto, it was found that they used the railroad tracks. That's how they got around Toronto, and that's how they get around the other Canadian cities. So keep the tracks, or you can turn them into biking trails. That's fine too. Anything that cuts through the neighborhoods is fine. Put some foliage on the side, you're in business. And the third way animals get around is through above-ground streams. Most of the streams in the cities were put underground in the last century. They're in drainage systems, they're in culverts, they're in pipes underground, and oftentimes the old stream beds were covered. But the animals need those to get around. Because think about it, they want to get from park to park. Now what makes a park? A lot of trees. And that meant the trees had water. So the streams were going from park to park essentially, back when they were above ground. And if we restored those stream beds, the animals would have safe passage. And that whole process of restoring the streams is called daylighting. Daylighting. I think this is a good time to talk about reconciliation ecology. I don't know if you know that term, reconciliation ecology, but it's an important term. It's a new branch of environmentalism. Traditionally, environmentalism meant save the wild places, save species, clean air, clean water. Don't let people screw everything up. And that's still the heart of the thing. But what reconciliation ecology does is it takes human-dominated environments and makes them more friendly to animals and plants and all other forms of life. I'll give you some examples. When we go to the big cities and see all these giant buildings made of glass and steel, the sun reflects off them and bakes the people down below in the asphalt. Well, what if there were solar collectors situated between these large buildings to pick up that sunlight? What if there were community gardens between the large buildings to give the tomatoes and the corn what they need in terms of heat? Cities aren't built like that, but they could be. And reconciliation ecology is about that. It's about rooftop gardens. Give tax credits for rooftop gardens, because it would solve a whole host of problems. You'd have cleaner air, you'd have beauty, you'd have habitat for animals. People would have vegetables to eat, would cut health costs. But again, this stuff has to be done in advance with city planning as opposed to always playing defense. So we can do this. And the thing about reconciliation ecology is that it's optimistic. Doing the work that we do with animal rights, there's a lot of suffering. But reconciliation ecology says we're part of the ecosystem. We can actually use our technology and pre-planning to make things better. Why not? And in that sense, it gets us out of a very pessimistic place so that we don't get caught in the suffering. If we're caught in the suffering, takes you down, takes your message down. So this is a way out. It's a way out that works for me anyway, is to think that people can actually make this a better planet. It can be done. One place we could use optimism is in the factory farms. And they're also known as CAFOs. C-A-F-O is CAFO. Stands for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation. They call it that within the industry. We call them factory farms. But that's where most of the suffering is. It saddens me when I go to these legislative meetings that the legislators are always hot to make dog and cat bills. They want to make things better for dog and cats. Fine, I love it. But they're afraid to take on the farm lobby. The farm lobby is extremely powerful. It's right up there with the NRA. And that is the case both at the both at the federal level and the state level. Very seldom will they take on the farm lobby. So we're going to have to get it done in the cities. And this is the most important thing that I'm going to tell you today is the cities are our way out of this. That is where we're going to get progressive legislation. And it's already happening. Who's in the forefront of the sanctuary movement? The cities. Who's in the forefront of the climate movement? The cities. After Trump pulled out of the Paris Accord, over 100 cities wrote to the Europeans saying, hey, we're in. And they have passed humane legislation too in the cities. For example, New York passed a law saying that no more circuses with exotic animals will be allowed in New York City. Other cities have done this too. Why do you think Ringling Brothers went out of business? It's partially because of changing public attitudes regarding animals, but another big reason is these exploitive industries can't survive without city support. That's where the big money is. So if you're going to do legislation, start out in the cities. So how do you get legislation passed in the cities? There are only 2 rules for successfully passing legislation. Unfortunately, nobody knows what they are. The way I did it is I would go to a town that I knew would pass something experimental. In California, it was Berkeley and Sebastopol, 2 very environmental areas. Get something passed there. And the other cities then look and see that it's not the end of the world. And in a year, they pass it too. And then you take it to San Francisco or Los Angeles, and then you take it to the state. But start out with a city that will try something new. When it comes to meat, the cities can do it too, because there are no farms and ranches within city limits. So they're not afraid of the farm lobby. See, that makes a big difference. That's how it's different from the federal and the state levels. They're not afraid of the farm lobby because the farm lobby doesn't exist in the cities. Plus, the voters there tend to be more progressive. So you put those 2 factors together and you have the opportunity for cities passing something that's really meaningful. And here's how they can do it. They can do it from the purchase end, not from the production end. Because it wouldn't make any sense for the cities to say, for example, you can't use antibiotics raising animals because there's no farms and ranches in the city limit. But they can say, we won't buy it. That's the purchase end, and that's what we can do. On so many things, go from the purchase end with the cities. I just mentioned antibiotics, but I want to say that for me, this is a key issue. Antibiotics are the Band-Aids that cover the abuses of factory farms. Without the routine addition of antibiotics in all of the animals' food and drink, the animals would die. They would have no business, and Therefore, if we say you can't use antibiotics, the choice is either go out of business or give the animals better conditions. So it's a win-win. It's a win for the animals because they'll get better conditions, because if they don't, they'll die without antibiotics. It's a win for people because we'll keep the use of antibiotics for ourselves and for animals too when they actually need it. The medical community is freaking out over the loss of the effectiveness of antibiotics. What happens is that people buy the meat. The meat's filled with antibiotics because it's added routinely in every feeding of the animals. People ingest it, and what happens is the bacteria develop very quickly that are resistant to it. And we're losing all the antibiotics, and if we jump all over this issue, we have allies that we usually do not. The AMA, the World Health Organization, they would be our allies. This is a chance to build a bridge. So I'm saying if you want to take one issue to your city council, make it antibiotics. It's a winner. And a lot of restaurant chains, like Subway's, advertise very prominently, no antibiotics. So it's a winner for them, too. The next subject I will address is education. Because you're not going to get city councils that are worth anything if you don't have an educated electorate. And education has to start at a very early age. I've been doing animal rights work, environmental work, 30 years now. And these movements are mainly comprised of women. So we've got to get young boys in the primary grades interested. They like superheroes. Let's bring back the Green Man. It's a natural. The Green Man was this leafy being, half tree, half person, who was in service to Mother Earth. And a very big figure in shamanistic cultures. And in the primary schools, let's teach basic things about the benefits of veganism. Let's teach about the link between animal abuse and domestic abuse. The link between what we eat and what's happening to our climate. These are all things that can be taught at primary grades. They're all provable things. They're not particularly speculative. And this goes up through the college level also. What would be different at a college level if we had a humane culture? Right now we have a lot of good degrees in wildlife management, wildlife biology, protection of species, reforestation. There's even an institute, a wilderness institute from the University of Montana. Great stuff. But where are the degrees and courses of study that teach reconciliation ecology? Where's the degree that teaches rooftop gardening, drainage systems on rooftop gardens? Where is the degree saying, how do we build the tensile strength into the overpasses so that we can put vegetation on them, so that animals will use them? All the things I talked about before, these degrees don't exist. And they need to. So at the college level, that would be a whole different thing to have those available and funded. And I'll get to the funding part later. I think I'll talk about law schools now. I don't know if there's any. I know there's attorneys in the audience, but I don't know if there's any law students. What would be different in law school if this were a humane culture? First of all, there would be more courses in animal law. There's already over 120 law schools that teach animal law. And this is due to the hard work of the Animal Legal Defense Fund. They put these together, they promote them, they make them possible. They pass out the curriculum so you don't have to invent the wheel. So if any of you are thinking of going to law school and want to know where these courses exist, there will be a link to it in the handout. There's a handout as you go out the door, and that's one of the links. The second thing that we would have to do in law school that they're not doing now. They have to teach more about regulatory law. It's a common misapprehension that the law affecting animals comes from legislatures. It doesn't. They set broad policies. All the nuts and bolts are done at these commissions and agencies, the FDA, Fish and Wildlife, the Colorado, various commissions. There's a bunch of commissions. So we need to know how to navigate the field of regulatory law. When I was in law school, there was this obscure course called administrative law that nobody took. But people have to take it. Because if we're going to change things for the animals, we have to know these agencies. Who's on the board? How do you get on the board? What are their timelines? What are their notice requirements? And that is not generally known by attorneys because it's not generally taught. So that would change in the law schools. And speaking of the law schools, let's switch to law itself. What, in my opinion, are some of the big things coming up in the next 20 years? First of all, animals are still property. That is the biggest issue. That is the basis of their exploitation. So we need always to work on that. I'll give you an example. I used to do a lot of divorce cases, and in divorce cases, there's often an animal, and a decision needs to be done about who gets the animal, who has custody. Those decisions were always made on property concepts. Who bought the animal? Who pays the vet bills? Are those really the things we want to consider? Shouldn't we be talking about who does the animal like the most? Who spends the most time with the animal? That's how it should be. But that's only a factor in one state. 49 states don't even consider the best interests of the animal. One state, Alaska, has included that in this long list as one factor to be considered. It should be the main factor, like it is for children. They don't ask who owned the child, they ask where's the child happiest, who has the time. Who's put in the time, who's put in the love, who's put in the care. It should be that way. And the model's right there in the domestic courts. If they want to switch it over to animals, it's right there. Another issue has to do with standing. Standing in legal terms means you have the right to come into the court and present your case because you have a grievance that we are allowed to hear. Animals as property do not have standing, and people who try to come in and litigate for animals are told they don't have standing either. Why? Because the injury is not to you, it's to the chimpanzee. Who injured you? What are you doing in court? So this is the great paradox that Steve Weiss has been working on for years. Those who have injuries have no rights, and those with rights have no injuries. So out you go, get thrown out of court. One state, Pennsylvania, has given standing to SPCAs to initiate cruelty cases. But the other 49 have not. So if you live in one of those other 49 states, look at the Pennsylvania statute. See if you can get it done in your state. It's really easy to do. And it gets out of this whole unfortunate issue. Other issues that I think are important. Registries. It's essential that somewhere along the line we get registries for felony animal abusers. And we've tried. And they shot us down in Colorado, and in no state, as far as I know, has a registry been erected. A couple of counties, a couple of cities have done it, but no states. And you ask yourself why. You'd think everybody would want to know who the animal abusers are. The answer lies in the state's experience with the sexual offender registries. There have been a lot of unintended consequences, and all the states are very leery about setting up another registry. So it would have to be very tightly worded, and it would cover only the most serious crimes. But it's necessary, because if somebody goes in to adopt at a shelter, you want to know right away if this person is likely to be an abuser because they were a felony abuser. And if the person at the desk has to page through 20 minutes of trying to find it in some obscure table, they're not going to do it. So it has to be something that's immediately accessible. And so this is something that I wish somebody in this audience would grab too, because we need some public outpouring of support next time we go up there and ask for a registry, and we're going to. The last part of the law issue that I want to bring up is this. Language. Language creates reality. And when I would go into court, I would always talk about companion animals. I mentioned that before. And back in the 80s and 90s, this was brand new. But we can do that in our lives now. When you're talking to your friends, say companion animals, not pets. Talk about custody, not ownership. Talk about, hey, you're eating a cow. It's not beef. When you're talking about a pig, mention pig. A wonderful, intelligent animal, not pork. And we can do this with our friends and family. It is very difficult sometimes, as I have experienced. But I think we need to do that anyway. That's part of our job, is to bring consciousness. The last major area I'm going to discuss is the humane economy. How do you create a humane economy? How do you make compassion profitable? Let's start out talking about ecotourism. Big business in Belize, Nepal, Brazil, enormous. And it's a great thing when it's real. But there's a lot of greenwashing in the ecotourism business. You're probably familiar with the term, but if you're not, greenwashing means presenting something as environmentally friendly, but it really isn't. And true ecotourism has respect for the local cultures. It has respect for the environment. You don't bring bulldozers in to put roads into roadless areas. You don't try to overwhelm the local culture with a giant hotel or build an underwater hotel in a fragile reef system. That's not ecotourism. So we need some regulation of that. Governments generally don't want to regulate it because they like the money. The tourists come, you can call it ecotourism, you can call it anything you want, but it's green, as in the color of money green. And so governments are not about to be serious in regulating ecotourism. So a lot of this will have to be private. Costa Rica does have a 0 to 5 rating system for any ecotourism adventures within their country. The University of Oregon has a greenwashing index. Government does have a part in all of this. China has recently said that they're going to ban the ivory trade. And if they actually do that, it would be huge. Because China and Southern and Southeast Asia are the main destinations for ivory. It's considered a sign of prosperity and long life, but not for the elephants. So if China goes ahead and enforces that, that would be great. And other governments are also doing some good stuff. The little island nation of Palau has said that its territorial waters are all shark protected. You can't fish for sharks in their waters. And Indonesia has done the same for manta rays. So some governments are doing something. But I think we're going to have to enlist the private sector here. And the airlines have stepped up quite a bit, actually. Air France and South Africa Airways are no longer shipping the products of trophy hunts. And as the other airways see that this works, it gains them business, they'll join in. And if trophy hunters can't ship it back, why would they shoot the animal? So this is going to help the animals. And transportation is the Achilles heel of these exploitive industries. If they can't get their illegal or ill-gotten product from A to B, they're not going to do it. So keep working on the transportation industries, the airlines, the shipping lines. That's where we can make our voice heard. You pick one link in the chain and you go for that. That's their weak link. And there's been other businesses that have stepped up too. Petco and PetSmart, they don't sell puppy-milled animals. They'll only do SPCA animals. And I mentioned Subway and how they're not going to do antibiotics. So the private sector is doing a lot of stuff. But the main thing, in my opinion, that the private sector can do is tell the backstory. And this has to do with meat particularly. What's the backstory of this meat? We as vegans, or almost vegans, want to know, where is this local? Is this organic? Those are the kind of questions we ask when we go to the market. Well, the carnivores ask questions too. Was this animal raised with antibiotics? Was this grass-fed or feedlot? What were the conditions there? So any market that wants to be conscious and can make the backstory known is doing a huge thing. And anybody that invents an app that'll send you all that information as you're standing there in the aisle, great business. Great help to the animals too. The last thing I want to talk about in terms of the humane economy is the place of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. They have a big part to play in this. NGOs can run sanctuaries that sometimes the volunteers go to. I talked about ecotourism. Sometimes the volunteers go to these places that are zoos. They're advertised as this great sanctuary, but they're zoos. But if they were run by the NGOs, I think that they would do better than the for-profit organizations that often run them now. The NGOs can be the recipient of standing, as I mentioned, in more than one state. And lastly, really, is the NGOs need to stop fighting with each other. I mean, I've been in this a long time, and they're fighting for donors, and they have secret information from each other. It's pretty bad. But there are some areas where the NGOs are coming together. One is in the corridors. Trying to build these wild ways, there are a number of groups that are sharing information. They're working in concert. There's even one here in Denver, Rocky Mountain Wild. Other ways NGOs are cooperating is in the costs for ag-gag cases. Now let me explain what ag-gag is, because it won't make any sense to talk about the costs if you don't know what it is. Ag-gag refers to the laws in a number of agricultural states that penalize criminally the taking of undercover videos. The factory farms and the slaughterhouses are scared to death of undercover videos, and that's why they passed these laws. Now, on 2 occasions already, these laws have been declared unconstitutional. And NGOs got together to do that. There were several that pooled their money, pooled their resources, and they defeated these ag-gag laws on First Amendment grounds, which is great. So the NGOs can do a lot. I'll cover the other issues quickly. First of all, the animal rights movement needs to join forces with other social justice movements. We are a social justice movement with a long, proud history. But we haven't joined forces. We have a long link with feminism, but what about the Native Americans? Were there animal rights presences there at Standing Rock? We missed an opportunity. There were environmentalists there saying, listen, Native American rights and clean water, same thing. And we have an opportunity to do that now because the bears, the grizzly bears in Yellowstone, there's a movement afoot to delist them from ESA protection. which means people can hunt them again. Several tribes in the area have already said, no, this is cultural genocide. And it is. And we should be there. Because they strengthen us and we strengthen them. It's all part of the same tree of dominance. And the quicker that we realize that and lend our support and receive that kind of support, the stronger we will be. Let me talk about native and non-native too. The distinction between native and non-native has long been crucial in setting any wildlife policy, but that's shifting. Because of climate change, animals are moving. And what was non-native 10 years ago will soon be native. So all those definitions are going to have to be reworked. And President Obama, in one of his last moves, made a rule saying that any decision involving invasive species must take into account climate change. So that's a really important thing to do. Here's another one. This is a big one. This is always lurking at the bottom of the pool, and that's human overpopulation. I spoke about that last year in my talk, so I'm not going to go into a whole tirade again. But I'll just say this. Everything that we do in terms of veganism, carbon credits, electric cars, is going to get swallowed up if the human population continues to grow at its present rate. That's just the sad fact. There will be more people, more transportation, less habitat, more people eating meat. If we don't get that under control, I don't know how we're going to win this, to tell the truth. That is the bottom line issue. And I need to mention veganism here too, because veganism is a bottom line issue. I'm not going to talk about it at any length because there's people in this building. There's people in this hall that know more about it than I do. And it's something we can all do. We can all do this. It doesn't take a court victory. It doesn't take an act of Congress. It doesn't take a lot of money. So it's something we can all do. So please go vegan. If you're not already vegan, go vegan. I mean, this is incredible. I'm just looking out, and I'm 75, and I don't take this for granted. So thank you for being here, spending your Sunday with me, and for everything you do for the animals. Thank you.